Hello, this is Robert Miller, Research Biologist with the Intermountain Bird Observatory. Thank you for attending our online webinar of the 2018 project results from Project WAfLS, predicting responses to short-eared owl population size, distribution, and habitat use in a changing climate. We had hoped that this was going to be a recording of a live webinar, but we had a couple technical difficulties, so I'm re-recording the presentation afterwards for your viewing online. Thank you for tuning in. To get started with Project WAfLS, Project WAfLS started a number of years back at the encouragement of this group of people. Those who have heard me present this before know that I give a lot of credit to Travis Booms from Alaska Fish and Game Department. He got a lot of short-eared owl experts together to really publish a paper to put forth the argument that we needed to pay more attention to the short-eared owl's conservation. Specifically, they made the argument that there's a long-term, range-wide, and substantial decline in this population, that the weight of evidence for that decline is convincing. However, we lacked the specific numbers to quantify that decline. We do believe the decline is between 60 to 80% in the last 40 to 50 years, but better information is needed to really prove that out, and the traditional survey methodologies do not adequately sample this population. Hence, we kicked off Project WAfLS. Project WAfLS has a number of different objectives. The first is a narrow definition to really look at the impacts of grazing practices through direct manipulation. This is a study I will highlight later in the presentation being led out by the University of Idaho, but in conjunction with our broader survey program. Looking at the survey portion that most of you tuning in probably participated in, the objective there is to quantify the population size of short-eared owls in each participating state, quantify how those populations fluctuate across the geography and also through time. This species is known to move and have very responsive population levels. To identify the distribution and the factors influencing that distribution, such as habitat, the impacts of grazing, and the impacts of current weather and climate. We want to be able to generate a statistically rigorous region-wide projection for the short-eared owl population moving forward so that we can really look at the areas most critical for conservation of this species, and we will do that by integrating with standardized climate models. And then lastly, we want to implement high-value conservation actions, and I'll talk about some of those conservation measures early on, but there will be other grander projects spin out of this as well. So what are some of the challenges with studying short-eared owls? First of all, it's driven by the core biology of short-eared owls, which is kind of unique in the owl and raptor world. This species, more so than most raptors we study, experiences very high fluctuations in population levels. It's kind of a boom or bust cycle. During good prey environments, they can have very large brood sizes, 10, 12 young. In other years, they'll go without breeding altogether. There's only a few other species that have this big of a pattern. The snowy owl would be another one that exhibits this kind of challenge. They fluctuate spatially, so they have very low site fidelity. We usually think of raptors as being highly committed to their territories and breeding in the same locations over time, but these birds can move broadly across the landscape and breed in different areas, much more so than other raptors. That makes them more difficult to track down. They're rare on the landscape, so you really have to invest a lot of effort to get an adequate sample size to have the confidence required to influence conservation. So we're stacked up against all of those. So we really need a long-term, broad geography, big program to overcome these limitations. The logistical issues, that scale is required for success. Looking at it from one state, even 4 states, is too limited to see some of the movements going on, and that'll become apparent in our 2018 results. And then we need to On a species that's highly dependent upon prey, we need to look at the prey cycles and ensure that we're sampling beyond the length of the prey cycle, which in these small vole populations can be 4 to 6 years is what we would expect, to really get an assessment on what's going on with the population. So the history of Project WAfLS, we started in 2015 in Idaho, and our partner Hawkwatch International in Utah did a limited pilot. In the Intermountain Bird Observatory led the Idaho program. In 2016, Hawkwatch scaled up to be statewide as well, so we were looking at 2 states. Then in 2017, we brought on the Nevada Department of Wildlife as a partner in Nevada, and the Teton Raptor Center as a partner in Wyoming. And then in 2018, we brought on the California Fish and Wildlife, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and Washington Fish and Wildlife, and the University of Wyoming Biodiversity Institute to lead the Wyoming initiative. So 8 Western states. It's a very impressive picture of the work that needs to be done and that we were able to accomplish. So this looks at the 8 participating states. The light blue color is the strata. So this is where we expect 95% of the breeding short-eared owls in the region to be. And the black areas are our survey locations spread across that geography. So if you're one of the participants, I would say thank you very much for contributing to our program. It's awe-inspiring to see the amount and quantity of effort that goes into this. So we together surveyed 368 regular randomized survey grids. 331 of those were surveyed twice. And then we have 31 hotspot grids. These are kind of special survey locations that were not chosen randomly, and thus we can't include them in all of our data analysis. They are usually national wildlife refuges or wildlife management areas, and typically the area biologist may do those surveys. Well, we completed 31 of those, 2 visits each, and detected owls on 11 of those, 57 of the other survey routes. As you know, if you participated, it's a big investment, and to get 622 volunteers across those states to contribute more than 6,000 hours is just amazing. So thank you very much. And we traveled a lot of miles to get out to do these surveys across such a broad geography. And the data is absolutely worth it to look back and assess the population. So this is what our detections look like. The red circles are the grids where short-eared owls were detected, and the blacks are where they were not detected. We got a pretty good distribution across all 8 states. We were very happy with our new states of California, Oregon, and Washington, and Montana to see the distribution there. I'm going to talk about 2 different analyses. I won't go into a lot of the details. If you have questions on the details later, let me know and we can help fill those in. The reason we do multiple analyses is to look at the problem from different viewpoints and get different types of answers and influences. The multi-scale occupancy modeling is really designed to pick out the few most important factors driving occupancy of short-eared owls in an area. And then later I'll talk about the maximum entropy model, which takes into account like everything put in together into one big stew. And so the first one are the few most influential factors. There's 3 levels in these multi-scale occupancy models. First of all, the probability of detection. So when I talk about probability of detection, I'm talking about the situation where there is an owl at the point, and you're at the point, what's the probability that you will detect that owl? Many people assume that it would be easy. It's really not. We're looking at about a 50-50 rate of detecting an owl given that there is one there. The second is the point scale occupancy. You know, a survey route has 8 to 11 points along a road. And the point scale occupancy is, why is this particular point better than another point, and what attributes about it? And then, then lastly, the top level is, why this survey route? Why would an owl occupy the survey route? So what's the broad scale habitat available there that would attract the owl in? And so they're slightly different questions which level in the model you're talking. So we'll look first at the probability of detection. So once again, there is an owl at the point, you're at the point. What influences whether or not you detect that owl? The day of year is a factor here. So the owl activity changes through the survey season, and as a result, they may be less visible. Early on in the season, we were hoping to catch the courtship display flights, where they fly high up into the air, clap their wings, tumble down towards the ground, and then pull up from the dive at the bottom. That's easily visible from a kilometer away. Later in the season, after they've paired up and the female may be incubating eggs and the male may be out hunting, they're more difficult to detect. So this is a predicted result. The black line is the estimate, and the green area is the 95% confidence that that estimate is within that realm. So as with all estimates, they're essentially wrong, but they're close. So we're saying that black line could move up a bit, down a bit, but it would stay within 95% probability that it would stay within the green area. And the green area itself is sloping downward to the right, so we're confident in that result, or we can call it statistically significant. The minutes before the end of civil twilight is an important factor as well. We specifically design our survey to approach right up to the end of darkness. And we see here that about 100 minutes before is the peak. That's when most of our surveys began. Some people started them earlier, but 100 minutes before, declining closer to end of civil twilight. We actually expect that the owl's activity to increase the closer to darkness that we move. But the ability to confidently identify and detect that decreases with our visual as it starts to get darker. So those two forces combat each other, and it comes out slightly negative here. And then wind conditions affects detectability, probably for two different reasons. One is that it's harder for us to identify birds at a distance when it's in windy conditions, when the wind's blowing 25 miles per hour, say. And the second is the male is probably less likely to be performing a display flight in those windy conditions. So they may be hunkered down someplace, saving the display flight for another evening. So remember, this is just saying they're there. This doesn't say that they're doing a display flight. What's the probability of detecting? It's given that they're at the point. What's the probability of detecting? And their behavior is one of those factors. So that's all to be expected. So let's move up to the next level in our model, which is point scale occupancy. Why would an owl occupy this point versus another point along this survey route? Well, let's talk about stubble agriculture. Stubble agriculture has come out positively every year of this program as something that short-eared owls are associated with. And if you spend much time out in the winter or early spring around stubble agriculture fields, you can tell a lot of raptors are. And that's because stubble agriculture fields are very beneficial to small prey populations. So the prey go there for the food, and the raptors go there for the food as well. Stubble agriculture, our top point predictor for presence, and it's strongly positive in the direction in that the probability of them being there, as even this 25% of the landscape is around the point of stubble agriculture, the probability that they would be there more than doubles. What about this? Does this look like good habitat for short-eared owls? The topic of grazing, as you noted back in the objectives, is an important one for us. Some previous studies have identified that short-eared owl occupancy is very incompatible with grazing, yet we have often found a intermediate level of compatibility in Project WAfLS, and this year is no exception. So we really look at this question, try to tune in this question, and there's that focus study at the University of Idaho that I'll talk about in a minute. But our study found that really low levels of grazing around the point can be beneficial, but if you get too much grazing, it drops off dramatically. And we note something here with the confidence interval. It's narrow on the left, wide in the middle, narrow on the right. That tells us that we sampled more points with low grazing and high grazing and not as many in the intermediate. And that may explain the difference in our results between the years. So negative, pretty much fully negative in 2018, but if we go back to 2017, we see a more intermediate response, which is they were more likely at locations with about 60% of grazing. So our results are not consistent with some of the other published literature, and that's why we pay such attention to the grazing practices. That so what are the treatments, what are the approaches, what are the aspects of grazing that are beneficial to short-eared owls, and what are the detriments? And maybe we can answer those in this program, and the targeted University of Idaho program will address some of that. So let's talk about survey occupancy. What's the probability that a bird will be along a given survey route? So a 6-mile stretch of road, what habitat within a kilometer of that road would influence the owl to be there? And we come out strongly with cropland. Remember, this is the one or two most important factors, and we find cropland strongly predictive. And that's probably because cropland is beneficial for most prey. So many prey species favor cropland over purely native vegetation. So we'll be looking into that, as well as potential conservation measures. So cropland can be beneficial to them being there. Later questions we need to ask, and this will come up later in the presentation, of does that favor their productivity though and success? So this is how the occupancy rates compare among the states. Think of this as density. This isn't total population, so it doesn't take into account the amount of habitat available. Montana had the highest occupancy, which means the highest density. They also have the most habitat, so they have by far the most largest number of short-eared owls. As the density decreases and the available landscape changes, the raw number of owls will vary. But this is just the density within each state. We see the northern states, Montana, Idaho, Washington coming in very positive, Nevada and Oregon shortly closely behind. If we look at this over the years, and I know this is a line graph, and we would usually represent this with a bar graph, but I like the connecting the dots continuity that this helps illustrate. So for the purists out there, please excuse my graph choice. But if we look at the Idaho population, 4 years of data now with a consistent methodology, we see that we had a very good year in 15, less than 16. We were very concerned last year in 17, and we're happy that we've bounced back a little bit. If we were talking about a 4 to 6 year prey cycle, this looks like maybe it'll be a 5-year cycle. We'll see what goes on next year. But we were pleased with the results. We note that Nevada, only in their second year of the survey, increased by a similar amount to Idaho, which you would expect neighboring states to maybe have that type of correlation. However, Utah and Wyoming, which neighbor each other but also neighbor Nevada and Idaho, declined by similar amounts. So this is why having a program on such a broad scale is important, as we can start to ask these questions of what happened differently on the broad geography that may have, one, favored populations in Idaho and Nevada, and not favored in Utah and Wyoming, or cause those birds to shift to the west, which would explain these results as well. So we have more work to do, but this is an exciting result, and we got the initial numbers for the 4 newest states, so we look forward to next year. So that's all occupancy. Now we're going to switch to the maximum entropy modeling. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is where we throw everything in the pot together, habitat, the geography, elevation, slope, aspect, ruggedness, and as well as all the climate variables, 19 different climate variables. So there's about 30 values in here that we're working with. And this is best used when you have lots of correlated variables and you want to keep them all in the models. The other multi-scale occupancy modeling I presented earlier is about variable reduction, finding those few factors. This is about keeping everything because the impact may be very small but important. So view as an aggregate, not as individuals. In the annual report, there's a bunch of funky little graphs like this. They're informative if you're used carefully, but for the most part, you should not focus on the individual graphs. You should look at the big picture when you're using this type of analysis. And this is the prediction model of where we would expect to find these fine short-eared owls across our 8 participating western states. The dark green is the highest viability areas, and the white is the lowest. Yellow is like a 50% viability area. So this is pretty good, and it agrees very well with the eBird data that we have and our understanding of the landscape as a whole. Now we can keep most of that data, the geography data, and even the habitat data, the shrubland, grassland values the same, but change the climate variables. And if we do that, projecting out 50 years to the year 2070, this is what the picture looks like. Now this is a very conservative view in that it assumes that everything that was shrubland is still shrubland and everything that was grassland is still grassland 50 years from now. And we know that climate and landscape change is going to affect that. But it at least starts to identify where our best habitat is, our most resilient habitat, and the areas where we might have the biggest concern, but also the biggest opportunity for conservation. This model uses the models endorsed by the International Panel on Climate Change. I chose the Hadley Center Global Environment Model because it deals with things like soil moisture and includes a number of factors that are important for small prey populations. And then as far as the climate projection, I use the 4.5 level model. This is assumes that we make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Our current path is towards an 8.5 emission scenario, so this is almost cutting that in half. And as you know, we aren't on that path today. So this is a very conservative model. It assumes the habitat doesn't change, and it assumes that we make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over those 50 years. And so what do the two look like together? This is just a subtraction of those two models. The green areas are the potential new growth areas for the species. The dark green, it comes out really strong. I don't think there's any on the picture. The red, pale red are major declines, and the bright red represent areas we would expect a complete extirpation of the species. So this is a pretty scary picture, especially when you know that it is a very conservative picture as well. So we'll be working more on this going forward. So what are some of those future analyses directions? We're going to continue to refine and improve the models, the predictor variables, etc. We're going to increase the emphasis on our climate change impacts and ensuring we're getting the best representation on the landscape. I want to integrate more predictor variables that deal with prey abundance that might explain some of these shifts, like between Utah and Wyoming towards Idaho and Nevada. Land use change, not only things like development or habitat degradation, but also broad-scale landscape change as a result of wildfire, things like that. Disturbance regimes, noise disturbance, part of the display flight of short-eared owls is noise related, and we have indications that this species is highly sensitive to both noise and other types of disturbance. Continue our grazing analysis that we'll be doing, and I'll give you an update on some of that here in a minute, and focus on those conservation actions. So now I want to shift from the broad survey results to that manipulative study on grazing. And this is leveraging off of a program at University of Idaho looking at sage grouse and grazing. They have a 10-year study to really dive in and manipulate grazing treatments and measure the response on sage grouse. And we have engaged with them to also add short-eared owls to their program, in that many of their experimental study areas have short-eared owls present. This is the first year of that integration. I believe it's the 4th year of their overall program. During the live webinar, we had them present directly, but I will cover it the best I can in this re-recording. So their study design is to have a number of pastures, 4 different treatments. By treatment, we mean grazing practices. So for the first 2 years of the program, they just grazed normally. So these are public land grazings. People, ranchers have grazing allotments to them, and they've been doing grazing practices on them. So for the first 2 years, they did the grazing, and the University of Idaho team went in and did all of the habitat measurements, biomass removed, etc. And then they start the manipulation. And in each pasture, there's a different treatment. The first is that they do spring grazing only in odd years, and let the pastures go ungrazed in the even years. And then pasture B's get the opposite treatment. Pasture C has no grazing at all, and pasture D is the normal operation of full grazing. And so these act as controls against each other in their analyses. So overall, they have 19 pastures that are between 5 and 38 square kilometers. This is Brown's Bench, I think, one of their study areas here in southern Idaho. And this is what it looks like with the various treatments split up by those different pasture treatments that I talked about in the previous slide. They overlaid all of their pastures with short-eared owl survey points and performed the same survey point protocol that our road-based surveys perform. So at each point, they did a 5-minute, minute-by-minute replacement searching for short-eared owls. The yellow dots here at Brown's Branch is an example of where they detected short-eared owls. And so they had quite a few detections, which is very important for this study. If they had no owls on their pastures, then they would not be able to look at the grazing impacts and vegetative impacts of owl presence. So that's just a zoomed in picture. They had a couple incidental observations as well when they're out doing other work like habitat work or trapping sage grouse. They had owl detections there. So in total, they completed 380 surveys. 54 short-eared owls were detected across their areas and had 33 more incidental detections. So a very good number of short-eared owls, and this bodes well for the ending analysis where we can look at the impact on grazing. In addition, they do very intensive vegetative sampling, and all of this is to come up with a determination of how much grazing pressure there is by the animals. Just because the animals are on a pasture doesn't mean that they're grazing it uniformly. They spend more time in certain areas and graze more heavily in certain areas. And that's what the team is looking at, is where is the utilization, grazing utilization, versus where are the sage grouse versus where are the short-eared owls. Just a very quick example here. The top and the bottom pastures are ungrazed, and as you can see, the utilization or the amount of biomass removed is very low. probably related to deer and elk and other wild animals that might be coming through the area. And then the central pastures there are 2 different treatments. And those treatments are where all the yellow and orange and red show up, which are the highly grazed areas. And you can see those treatment, while all of those areas are open to the grazing animals, they're spending their time in very specific locations, probably the most nutritious plants or what. And so they get these utilization maps, and that's really relevant to, so where are the cows, where are the grouse, and where are the owls. So stay tuned on that. That's a very big program, and it took a lot of effort from a lot of agencies to really pull it together. The Idaho Cattle Association and the Cattle Foundation have been very helpful, as have all the permittees. These are grazing allotments, and the grazers had to agree to participate. So we thank all of them and look forward to more results on that. So let's shift to the overall conservation issues, and these are not yet conservation issues at the broad scale, looking at the broad occupancy trends, because we don't have those trends yet. It'll be another year or 2 before we get those. However, these are all conservation issues that our team has uncovered and have found evidence of on the landscape. When you send 622 people out to look for a species, they tend to find all sorts of things, and this is a powerful part of such a broad program. So first of all, roadway mortality. In the last 3 years, we've collected 123 mortality events. We have GPS coordinates for each of these and photos of each of these. And I have a student, Josie Braun, here at Boise State University, who is analyzing some of that data for her GIS class. This is where those hot spots have been located in the past. Now with the broader 8-state view, we expect more reports coming in, but some hot spots where a lot of activity, mortality is occurring in Utah and Idaho and in western Wyoming. Zooming in a little bit, we see the hot spots. That, first of all, I should say the dark green is the prediction map that comes out of the WAfLS surveys. So back when we were talking about climate models and such, that this is the current distribution that we think short-eared owls would occupy. And then the purple to red to yellow is the heat map for where the mortality events occur. And the blue, little blue dots indicate mortality locations. First of all, we rarely find these on the interstate. There are some over by Market Lake. They're very much habitat induced, we think. Market Lake spans the interstate, so there's habitat like right next to the interstate on both sides of the road. But high mortality event, 33 carcasses in a single season up near Mud Lake, Idaho at the north there, and then a lot down in the Howell, Utah area. Now these are not the result of formal surveys, so we don't have a statistical model for these. These are just reports, and so we expect that this occurs more often, but we're in the process of developing more of a formalized survey that could look at this statistically. Those mortality events over in Wyoming are near the National Elk Refuge. So stay tuned on that. The next issue are fence collisions. This is something that short-eared owls share with sage grouse. There are a number of conservation measures going in place for sage grouse, and we hope that will also benefit short-eared owls. We know of at least 3 incidences of fence collisions by short-eared owls. So we'll be looking at this. Some of the countermeasures are flagging on the fence lines. I know the NRCS and state agencies are trying to work with ranchers to flag those barbed wire fences to try to decrease this type of mortality. Another is agricultural harvest timing. It didn't happen in this particular field, or at least we don't think, but we know of at least a number of nests that have been plowed under by harvest practices. So if you think about the fact that these birds are attracted to stubble and fallow agricultural fields early in the season, they set up nesting there, and then growing season comes along and those nests are plowed under. So we know of a few incidences where this has occurred. We expect it occurs very broadly because a lot of the agricultural timing coincides with the reproductive season of short-eared owls. So we would like to quantify this, and we are in discussions with the NRCS once again for possible mitigation measures and programs for delayed harvest and things like that in areas that are very high priority for conservation. We're never going to prevent all of them. Another one that just seems like it should be easily preventable, but is remarkably difficult, is stock tanks on the landscape, both public and private. They're all supposed to have bird ladders, so birds that get in the tanks can walk out of the tank. But here's an example of 4 short-eared owl deaths in the Wahi Mountains in southern Idaho from 2018. I rescued an adult male goshawk a couple years ago from a tank in further east in Idaho. So it's sad when this occurs, and it is preventable. We're working on it from state conservation, like the Idaho Bird Conservation Partnership has this as one of their initiatives to try to make improvement on. So sad affairs there. Next up is rodenticide. Our team has not collected or had any evidence of rodenticide, but the anecdotal threat is very large. Study in California looked at golden eagles, common ravens, and turkey vultures. They had rehab centers send in all their dead carcasses, and they tested them for the presence of second-generation rodenticide. And only 8% of those carcasses were thought to have died by poisoning. However, another 12% had debilitating levels of second-generation rodenticide, and then another 64% of those carcasses had evidence of rodenticide in their system. So 84% of the raptors that were collected had ingested second-generation rodenticide. So it just shows to the pervasive nature of this issue. Golden Gate Raptor Observatory in California took blood samples from migrating red-tailed hawks and found that 8% of them had recently consumed second-generation rodenticide. These were live birds that were seemingly fine at the time. Blood samples aren't the best way to test for rodenticide, but they found 8%. So the rodenticide is stored in the liver, so they basically, if it is detected in the blood, it means that they were recently consumed the rodenticide. A similar study to the first one from California, this one from Massachusetts, found 96% of their raptor mortalities across species were influenced or had second-generation rodenticide residues. Let's see, another study, barn owls in Vancouver, had 100% were dosed with rodenticide. So we'll keep a look on that. On the good news is we have tested 2 roadside mortality carcasses. I know that doesn't sound like good news, but one from Utah and one from Idaho, they both came up negative for second-generation rodenticide. But it's an expensive program, $150 a sample, so we haven't tested a lot of them yet. But we are collecting a sample database so that when we do get some funding, we can get those tested. So moving forward, 2019 plans. Project WAfLS plans to continue in much similar fashion as 2018. We're going to make some survey timing adjustments in Montana and a little bit in Wyoming. I received this photo, and I applaud Amy's commitment to get out there and get her survey done, but this is really too early for short-eared owls to be on this landscape. So we really need snow-free landscape, and we estimated that incorrectly in Montana this last season. So we'll be making those adjustments. We'll be replacing a few surveys that were inaccessible because of either road access or road condition, or they were gated off, or private landowners disagreed with our presence. So in all of those cases, we move those to another suitable area nearby that should be more accessible. But basically, if we were successful at surveying it in 2018, it should be the same survey route in 2019. We're going to improve some training in some key areas. Overall, our participants did an excellent job, but we have some recurring errors that show up in up to 10% of our data records, like the 24-hour time. Many people are challenged with that. I can usually figure that out between the points. And then standardizing the coordinate format. Some people are recording the wrong formats, and so we had some iterations on that. So we'll do a little more focused training on that. We have a new data entry portal. It's a little more complicated than last year, but the data goes directly into a professional database that's tied into the various agencies and conservation organizations that matter, and the data is backed up and managed appropriately. We ran quite a bit of risk using the free tools that we've used the last couple of years, and it'll be good to get it on a industrial system. And so it's going to be housed by Avian Knowledge Northwest. Our partners at Klamath Bird Observatory really helped get that put together. And then we're going to continue to focus on conservation actions, and as those bigger conservation actions come out through our population trends and such, we expect to have even more impact. But look to see more on the fence lines and roadway mortality and rodenticide and stock tank issues as we move forward. So this is the point in the live webinar when we would ask questions and have discussion. I would encourage you, if you have questions and you're a participant, please reach out to your state coordinator. If not, you can post your questions on the Project WAfLS Facebook page, or look at the contacts on the Project WAfLS page to get a hold of us, and send me your questions and suggestions. We really want to hear from you. So thank you for taking the time to listen through that. I know there's a lot of content. We do have the annual report out on the website that should back all of this up as well. So thank you. Thank you for your time. And if you're in one of the 8 states, we would love to have you on as a participant in 2019. Thank you. Take care.